I'll just say a couple of sentences about me. I am Anand Safi. I'm currently an engineering manager at Mark43. It's a public safety SaaS company. And I currently lead the mobile teams here at Mark43. I would like to welcome Bill Press, who is currently the SVP engineering at Iterable. And before that, he has experience across many teams, especially his last role with Optimizely, where he led a tech team of 100 plus strong, actually. So I will hand it over to Bill to add to his introduction, and then we'll get started on this wonderful topic.
Thanks, Anand. My name is Bill Press, and as Anand said, I am SVP of Engineering at Iterable and ran engineering as the SVP at Optimizely before that. Actually built my career in software as a developer at a small search engine startup, not named Google, that went through multiple acquisitions. And after those acquisitions, I ended up at Salesforce, which is where I cut my teeth in management. And I'll say actually that being an engineer and a technology leader is actually my second career. My first was in neuroscience, which included getting a PhD from Caltech and doing a postdoc at Stanford studying the organization of the human visual system. And I'll also mention, finally, that I'm a longtime Zen student. And I don't usually include that in my introduction, but given that we're talking about executive presence and what it means to be an executive, Zen is definitely a practice that's informed how I lead and maintain executive presence. And it'll come up probably at some point throughout this conversation.
Great, thank you, Bill, for that introduction. I'm sure your PhD in neuroscience has definitely had a lot of kind of impact, directly or indirectly, on the executive presence part and the characteristics. We'll talk more about that soon. So, given your current role at Iterable, would love to start just knowing about the kind of work Iterable is doing, or just even the kind of engineering teams or projects that you're currently leading.
Sure. Yeah, I can definitely talk about that. So let's see, I started working at Iterable a little over a year ago, and then I joined full-time in September. And just so everybody knows, because probably not everybody here is familiar with Iterable, the mission of Iterable is to connect people with the organizations and products that they love. It's basically automated cross-channel marketing. And the idea is to unify the customer experience and provide a metrics-driven platform for optimizing interactions between companies and the people who love those companies. And we just closed our Series E. We raised 200 million at a valuation of 2 billion. So it's a really fast-growing company, both in terms of the business and in terms of the organization. And a lot as a leader of my focus right now is making sure that we make that transition through growth successfully. That means making sure that we're preserving the culture that we have, which is really a phenomenal culture, and also making sure that the technology that we're building is done in a consistent and scalable way. So it's an exciting time because it's high growth. We're building a ton of really great product, but we're also making significant fundamental investments in the architecture. So that's very rewarding.
Congratulations to you and the team on closing this mega round of funding. I'm sure there's, with all that kind of excitement comes high growth, growing pains, and then the scaling the right way. So yeah, a lot of work, I'm sure, that is underway, actually. So coming to our topic today, that is executive presence. It's a loaded term in terms of even it's just two words. I would love to get your simple take on terms of when you look at this term, what does it mean to you actually, or how would you present it to some the broader audience in general?
Sure. Okay. So in many ways, I see the executive role as a social role. So one of the most important things you can do as an executive is to present yourself in a way that inspires confidence and others to trust in your leadership. And there are things you can do to create that trust. There are actions like being competent, following through with consistency, and showing that you're making decisions that aren't just in your own self-interest. And if you're familiar with the trust equation, you should look it up. It's really great. It's a very nice encapsulation of those principles. But those are things that you do and actions that you demonstrate. And the way I see executive presence is actually more ephemeral, and it's based on how others perceive you in the moment, regardless of what your actions are long term. That actually has a really big impact. And it requires, in my opinion, presenting yourself with confidence, positively, and with energy to inspire teams. And there are basically three ways that I see doing that, right? There's how you present yourself physically, and that includes your body language, how you talk and express yourself, and that you're authentic and that you're accessible at the same time. And actually, I think it's worth saying a few things about each of those, if that's all right.
Yeah, absolutely. Please go ahead.
Yeah. So physically, that's really how you hold yourself and use your body. And that has a big impact, I've found, on how people see you. It's a little harder in Zoom because we don't see each other's whole body. So there's a lot that's lost in terms of body language, but there's a lot that can still be captured. And if you're interested in this, there's a book called Impro by Keith Johnstone that's been my touchstone around body language and social status, which is part of executive presence. The second thing I mentioned is how you talk, and that's small things that can inspire confidence, which I'm actually noticing I'm doing some as I'm answering your questions, Anand, like answering, like making statements that end with a rising inflection. And I noticed that I'm doing that a couple of times, or being aware of ums and uhs. And these are natural. The key thing is to try to be aware of them when they happen and controlling them as much as possible. And then I would say the biggest thing around executive presence that makes me so interested in it is staying level when you're upset. And this is important both in the tone you use when you talk with people, or I should say the tone I use when I talk with people, and what I say when I'm talking with people, what the content is.
Awesome. Thank you for that umbrella summary of executive presence. There is some great things in there, starting with the trust equation. Funny that I just came across it this morning, actually, during my coffee time, and I shared it with my team internally just this morning in terms of when I read about the entire trust equation. So highly recommend that to folks here. As you said, there are many things like personality, decision-making, authenticity, and just also operating with emotional strength, actually. So when we talk about these different kind of powers or characteristics of executive presence, the first thing that comes to my mind is the classic notion that either you're born with it or either this can be learned, actually. So what is your take or hot take on this, that do we need to be born with these things, or is this skills that people can develop and invest in time in?
Well, I have a 12-year-old. I don't see very many children who have executive presence, and that's probably true for it's probably true for you too. I don't think it's something that you could really be born with. There are certain characteristics that might make it easier for you to develop the skills needed to demonstrate executive presence, but even just Ian, I'll actually say that in just a second. I'll answer that in just a second. Even the ability to process emotion fast enough to keep an even keel, that's not something that I think occurs naturally to most people. That's something that takes time to develop. And a lot of us as parents put a lot of work into developing in our children, but nobody has that easily, naturally, right from the get-go. There is a certain amount of confidence that you have to develop to have executive presence. And maybe some people are born with that, but I personally wasn't. I was really sensitive growing up, and that can be hard for a child. And it meant that I was an easy target for being picked on. And so I didn't have a lot of confidence when I was young. I had to develop that confidence by working through a lot of that insecurity and making mistakes and seeing what I actually had what I needed to recover from those mistakes and make better choices. Also, I'll say that we talked about, I mentioned that the executive role is a social one. I'm naturally an introvert. And so I'm an introvert in an extrovert's job. So there was also quite a bit of learning for me and stretching to develop that. And to answer those questions, in the book reference that I made earlier was Impro by Keith Johnstone. It's actually about improv, but it's got a lot of really great tools that you can use as an executive and a leader. There you go. Thanks, Anu. And then also we talked about the trust equation. That's actually from a book called The Trusted Advisor.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Bill, especially sharing the notion that it's something that needs to be developed and from your own personal experience. Same with me, actually, pretty much being an introvert and had to just kind of learn as I go and kind of refine, reflect, and just develop my own I would say operational mindset. And a lot of things were just, I would attempt something, gather feedback, gather the true radical candor, and then improve upon it actually. So there is no fixed kind of natural way of doing things. Things become more natural as you do more things actually. That's something that I can say. One key thing that you mentioned right at the end about executive presence was the emotional strength aspect, right? And this is something really important, this being a social notion that especially it can become a little chaotic when you're leading large teams, when you're chartering large missions, getting people motivated towards a common goal who have diverse personalities and diverse kind of approaches actually. So how do you as an executive stay calm under this chaos, and especially when there's pushback or less kind of common agreement or just there is not a positive sentiment going around?
Yeah. How do you stay even keel in difficult times is a great question. It's important that leaders, I think, stay sensitive because that's what makes us empathetic. And I think empathy is what makes us great leaders ultimately. But that means that for myself, I've had to develop the ability to really own my emotions. So when there's chaos, when there are things that aren't going my way, or I'm getting pushback on something that I think is important, I'm going to have a reaction. So the question is, what do I do with that reaction? And I don't think the answer is not to have the reaction or to try to stuff it away. For me, what I've developed in order to maintain that even keel, which is really probably for me the hallmark of how I lead and my brand, the emotions have to be something that I own completely, and that I don't reactively, reflexively try to change the conditions around me just because I'm uncomfortable or I'm upset. Now, it might be that I decide to make changes in whatever's happening. It might be trying to change somebody's mind or change something in the organization. But if I'm doing it reflexively out of that emotion, first of all, it's going to be hard to have people want to follow me through that. And second of all, I wouldn't have confidence that I'm actually going to be making these changes in the most skillful way possible. So I mentioned practicing Zen. For me, that's helped me develop the ability to feel the upset without reflexively reacting outwardly. And for me, that's been a lifelong journey. It's not something that's, okay, I learned it, now I'm done. It's something that I'm continually iterating on. And so are there times that I get upset at work? Absolutely. Are there times that I react reflexively and in ways that I don't think is skillful? Less than I used to. So of course I do, but I'd say it's become less frequent and less intense by practicing the ability to just feel my emotions.
That is a great call out in terms of there's a difference between beliefs and emotions actually. So you can definitely have an opinion on a certain decision, but you cannot let the emotions get the better of it actually. So just to segue into something that is around beliefs and not letting emotions affect it is the notion of personal branding. So personal branding for me, as I see it, is trying to share your values, beliefs, goals to everyone around you and making people aware in an authentic fashion. So I would love to get your take or from your experience on when should personal branding really start? Is it before you become an executive, or is it since now you are an executive, you should continue to not push but share your kind of goals and beliefs more broadly with the team actually, so everyone is aware on what is that common mission or goal that they should rally towards?
Yeah, definitely. It's something that happens continuously. And it's interesting you call it personal branding. I think that's a really great way to see branding. And Actually, I think there are two takes on branding that are worth mentioning. One is where you're simply authentically sharing your values. And that's what you're describing. And
Yeah,
absolutely, that's something that needs to happen all the time. That's not something that's you do at the beginning of your career. You get the position you want and then you let it go.
right.
Um, the second thing is there's actually an element of consciously crafting a brand. And that's something that you'll read about when people talk about executive presence or how to inhabit an executive role and or how to grow your career. And I would say I've often had a negative reaction to that way of thinking about brand. But to be honest, when I look back on my career and thought about what I did, I realized there are times where I've had to be very conscious about how I'm manifesting myself to other people. And there may be things that are part of my natural expression that obviously, when I'm being authentic, come out. But there may also be things where I know that there's something that's a part of me that may not naturally manifest itself. And I actually have to put effort and energy into doing that. So for example, for me, I come across very level and even keel. And so throughout my career, I've had to make sure that the people around me understood the sense of urgency that I've internalized, because it doesn't always come across naturally with a very level tone.
Yeah.
So I will have to remind people, like, we have to do this. This is an urgent problem we need to solve. And I'll even at times say to somebody, I'm very oriented towards urgency. So ... And it's a way of reinforcing those parts of myself that are naturally there and important to me, but might not naturally come out with the way that I'm expressing myself.
Great.
I don't know if that exactly answers your question, but
no, it does actually, and something that just kind of I realized when you said that in terms of expression and communicating urgency is in general communication and transparency. So especially when you're leading large teams actually, and executive presence matters a lot, especially because we are not in office and you cannot talk to every single person on Zoom or get on a call with them. So what are some ways that you have experimented or kind of know that work in terms of making your presence felt, that at least you're there in terms of if there's a question, or even when you had to share something with your group, what are some ways that you communicate and be transparent with the wider group actually?
yeah, well, and I'll tell you, it was a lot easier when we were all in the office. And I could just walk around and ask how people were doing and, just swing by people's desks. And now there's really no easy way to just swing by people's desks. So for me, I've had to be much more conscious about getting time at all hands, making sure that I was hosting different forums as all hands, either company all hands, engineering all hands, making time for Q&A at the ends of those, and really leaving it very open-ended and anything goes. And that accessibility, I think, helps. And making sure that people see that I'm there. So I have to create the presence intentionally by holding these all hands meetings in a way that I didn't have to do that before. And then when I've talked about showing up authentically in these all hands, there are times where I'm talking the way I'm talking with you right now, where it's very simple, it's straightforward, there's confidence. But then there are other times where maybe a hard question is asked or something has happened that I know people are upset about. And there I allow people to see how I feel and share that with others. And that makes me more, I know that makes me more approachable, which is hard in this role. Even just the title has a power difference that can be intimidating. So being accessible in how I speak to people and being emotionally open has made it so that when people are upset, I've noticed there are individuals on my team who will come to me. Even engineers will come to me. And that's something that I see as really important and not easy to do.
Yeah, really great call out on the being approachable part, because especially with this term, there's a power dynamic at play, right? There is a psychological power dynamic at play, and I would love to hear in terms of how do you not become a bottleneck for the team in terms of it's not that every single minor decision needs to go through the executive who's leading the teams or as a higher hierarchical authority actually. So how does empowering teams or empowering decisions become a part of the role? And it's also like a kind of trait of executive presence.
Yeah, well, I think we talked about authenticity, and I think part of being authentic and open is trusting your team. And so if I didn't trust my team, then yes, I would need to review basically every decision. But my goal with my directs, who are senior directors, who are managing the engineers in the organization, or the managers who have the engineers in the organization reporting to them, is to empower them as much as possible. So to give a really clear remit, and when I want to see changes, I work through those senior directors as opposed to reaching down into the teams myself. That's a very quick way to undermine directors, is to go directly to managers or engineers in order to try to affect change. So there are times where I have to strike a balance, where I might reach out to a director, maybe an engineer will reach out to me, or maybe there's a meeting that I'm in where there's a larger audience. I will balance biting my tongue and giving feedback directly to the senior director, and sometimes saying something directly in that meeting. And I would say there's no formula that I follow. It's really just trying to strike a good balance between giving ownership to those individuals, but also making sure that we're moving quickly enough and that the right decisions are made in a timely manner.
Great. Yeah, it's great about the art of delegation and kind of giving people the ownership on accountability while staying current, or just seeing that things are moving in the right direction from an overall perspective, actually. So I wanted to give a quick plug that we'll get to the Q&A section in a few minutes. So if people have questions, definitely put them in the Q&A tab. Upvote the questions that you feel you want to be answered. And I'll till then ask one more question that I have for Bill, and then we'll get to the Q&A. So Bill, in terms of the executive presence, I would say at the heart of everything is, along with being authentic, is appearing confident or being confident, probably more being confident than appearing actually. So for newer leaders or people who are just kind of entering an executive role at a new team, new company, where you don't have enough context on what is going on actually, how do you become confident quick, or how do you gain that confidence so that you can pass that down to keep the team motivated and just make sure that they know that there is good leadership that is present and things are moving in the right direction?
Yeah, well, I think you just gave some of the answer yourself, which is being present, right? I mean, when you're a new leader in an organization, you're not going to know a lot of the answers, and you don't need to know a lot of the answers. Really, a lot of this role is knowing good questions, and that requires paying attention. It also requires context. So I'm very willing to ask questions that I think might be obvious in order to learn, and being unafraid to ask those questions and not apologizing when I ask them. Just being very straightforward and saying, so remind me how this works, or tell me how our queuing system works, or what does it mean when you said X, Y, or Z? Is people have learned in my organization that I'm very willing to ask questions and learn. It's one of our fundamental values, so that helps, is that our culture supports that inquisitiveness. But I would say being authentic, curious, you don't have to, being authentic also doesn't necessitate that you emphasize your insecurities. So that's something to be aware of. There is a certain element. I saw there was one of the questions, and we'll talk more about it. Actually, I'm happy to unpack that, where there was a question about imposter syndrome. And that's something I've experienced and still experience sometimes. And that's very natural. So when that comes up, I treat that as, okay, there's an emotional experience, as I referred to before, just being available for it, owning it, moving through it. And if you're in the middle of talking with a company, when that comes up, there's an element to fake it till you make it, where I talk a lot about authenticity, and that's very important to me and an important part of how I lead. But there are times where you might be feeling something where being authentic could undermine the confidence of your team. And again, there's the judgment call you have to make.
Yeah, I think you made a really great point, because I was under the kind of notion at times that being authentic doesn't mean that you're being honest, but also how much honest is honest enough, in terms of you don't need to uh, say every single weakness of yours, or just say that you're vulnerable with all of these things. Actually, there are things that you can be open about, but should be continual improvement along those things that you are at least developing to address those, actually. So you cannot always draw a line or put a silo around that this is what I'm good at, and look, I told that these are my weaknesses, or this is where I'm always vulnerable. So that is just, you can state it once early on, but that is something that you should continually strive to improve and build upon, and get better at, actually. So yeah, thank you for that realistic take on that. That there's a difference in between being truly vulnerable, and then there's a difference between working to address those things, actually, in the long term.
Yeah, and actually, to add on to that, I'll say again, being authentic is important, but it doesn't mean that you're transparent with everything going through your mind. And a great example is when you're angry. I'm not, if I were completely transparent and had no filter, I might want to yell at somebody sometimes. I'm not going to do that, right? That would be completely unprofessional, undermine the team's confidence and trust in me. So my responsibility as an executive is to completely own my emotions, and then be thoughtful about how I express myself to the team to make sure that I continue to earn their trust. And definitely things like anger, frustration, those are things that I have to own completely and be really careful about how I express myself. But I think the same goes with my own insecurities. Those are things that really are my responsibility, that I own, and aren't my team's problem.
Great. Yeah, totally. Understand that, and fully support that. So we will go on to the questions now. And the first question actually is really relevant to what you were just saying. It's from Balki. Is how does authenticity play into the executive presence, the focus being on the word executive? Because how do you balance just being yourself with being an executive, as the term is perceived generally?
Yeah, and I think I just answered that question, actually. Like, that's pretty much it. How do you balance being yourself with being an executive? I just want to emphasize from what I just said before, it is absolutely a balance. There is not just, I don't just show up and let it all fly. Like, there is a certain role that I'm playing as an executive that's an important role. And yet authenticity is an important part of that role. And it's a bit paradoxical. And that's part of what makes it a difficult position. And I'm not sure I really have a great answer for how, honestly, except to be as aware of myself as possible, and as aware of the needs of the organization or the conditions arising in this moment as possible, and then just do my best.
Great. Yeah, that makes sense again, 100%. So the next question is from Alan, which is, how have you coached freshly promoted managers when they appear shy to exercise influence? And this relates to the imposter syndrome that you were referring to earlier.
How have you coached when they appear shy to exercise influence? Yeah, right. So that shyness can be because of imposter syndrome, can just be social anxiety. And there's a lot of reasons why I've noticed people can be shy. And I will say, actually, it's not just freshly promoted managers. Most of the people I've coached who have this experience, Andrew, are engineers who are moving into a leadership role as an individual contributor. And I want to see them being able to provide leadership in meetings or technical conversations, and even leadership in terms of team dynamics. And sometimes in making that transition, I have engineers who just aren't that comfortable doing that. And yet they aspire to this more leadership role. And so, and I've seen that more than with people who become managers, because I've noticed a lot of the people who become managers have already kind of cut their teeth in the technical leadership. So they've already had to develop those skills in a way. But regardless, however you see them, whether there's freshly promoted managers or ICs who are trying to grow their leadership skills, what I do when I work with people through this, which I have, is two things. One, talk about the behaviors. Hey, I saw in this meeting that this happened. This was an opportunity for you to say something, but you actually pushed your chair back from the table. Or, over Zoom, it would look a little different, but they just didn't speak up. So we would talk about that. Then we talk about why that happened. And usually when we talk about why that happened, it moves into a conversation that's more internal. Like, what were you experiencing? What did that trigger for you? When you imagined yourself saying something, what arose? And so, and also, I've also had those conversations bring in questions of privilege and how they were brought up, what culture they came from, what their experience has been in our culture, with either the race, sexual orientation, gender, whatever it is, that all plays into it. So being willing and open to talk about these things and partner with somebody, I think, is really important. And then it's not just one-time coaching. It's not just a one-time conversation of mentoring. It's really ongoing, being their partner and advocate, making a point of going to meetings that they're in, watching their behavior, taking notes, and circling back with them after the meeting and having a conversation about it. So really engaging fully, wholeheartedly in that process with somebody. That's the main way that I've done it. And being very frank and direct.
I really like your kind of point that the authenticity goes beyond just you being an executive about your own self and those all-hand conversations. It also relates to talking or connecting with people in a one-on-one fashion and getting them to be more open, be more willing to embrace actually what they're going through and speaking about it, right? Why they were not active in a certain meeting, or why they were not kind of in favor, or just putting their opposition out strongly, because things often surface. I've experienced that people do have opinions. They just don't communicate that in the moment, actually, or they just don't speak up at times. So just trying to get people to also be their own authentic selves is a huge part of this, actually. So really, really kudos to that recommendation. I actually missed Alan's question, sorry, and I went to Andrew's, but to Alan's question, which is, what behaviors or skills do you employ when building new relationships with senior/executive leadership? I think that's a great question. Yeah.
That is a great question. So I'm assuming you're talking about my peers, right? Like the head of product or head of marketing, success, sales. And I would say a couple of things. It depends on who I'm talking to. Product is usually a little different, because product I'm partnering really closely with, whereas I partner less closely, say, with sales. Like, there's still an important relationship and there's still an important partnership, but the nature of that relationship is different. And same with finance. So the number one thing is, I was going to say two number one things. Number one things are transparency. So over communicating what's happening in your department. I have a monthly newsletter I sent out to the entire company. And I expect actually the most important audience for that newsletter are my peers on the executive team. So, and I try to write it at that level. So communicating a lot about what's happening in the department, where there are really great things going on, and make sure they know that. Where there are challenges, I make sure they know that. And then the second number one thing is curiosity and learning more about their function and how I can support their function. That's especially true in the partnership with product, where I would say before anything, it's leading the number one behavior that I demonstrate in meeting with product, especially, I just joined Iterable. I joined as a advisor in the spring of last year, so a little over a year ago, and I joined full-time in September. And so this is still very fresh for me. And the number one most important thing I do when meeting a new head of product or when I'm new in a role and meeting with the head of product, is reinforcing the primacy of our partnership to me. It doesn't help anybody if there's an antagonistic relationship between engineering and product. So that spirit of partnership, curiosity, and over communicating both great things that are happening and the challenges that are happening. Like when there are incidents, I make sure in production, which are inevitable, I actually report out on that in multiple ways and do that in a way where it's clear that we have our arms around it. And that's part of expressing confidence. But I do share transparently with the organization what's happening around those.
Yeah, and this just ties into many things in terms of being an executive. Even say you're just an engineering executive, is way beyond engineering teams. For true high-performing teams, actually, you need that transparency and authenticity with your sales, your design team, your product teams in that regard. Even the managing up part, actually, this also ties into the trust equation. The trust equation is not only with your direct reports and the engineering, but it's also within the team between different disciplines, actually. So because this can have a domino effect. If you sugarcoat anything or just give something that is kind of misrepresented or hiding the true kind of nature of the situation, that will be communicated outside in many different forms beyond your control or knowing, and it can truly cause a kind of a wrong decision in the company's overall roadmap, actually. So just trying to be transparent right from the start, even within the team, is a great call out. A question from Balki, follow-up question, which I think executives will, if not already, will definitely be subjected to soon in this role, is how do you prepare when you have to present in high-stake settings? Example, a board presentation or a company all hands, especially when you have short windows of time, you want to pack everything in that 15-minute all hands that you do virtually, all those things. You don't have that face-to-face time. What are some kind of great things to keep in mind here?
Great question. Well, the first thing I do is before I start preparing anything, I ask, what do I want to come across? Like, what do I want to leave them with? The most important thing is, what do I want them to feel? Like, do I want them to feel worried, which is possible? Like, I may want to raise an alarm, which can be totally appropriate at any level. I may want to leave them instilled with a sense of confidence. And that often, what I want to have them feel usually will reflect what I'm feeling. So if I think things are under control or might be having a difficult time, but are headed to being under control, then I'll want to project and instill a sense of confidence. If I think things are off the rails and I don't have the tools I need to get things on the rails, for example, it might be headcount, that's a common one, then I might want to instill a sense of concern. So first I want to figure out, what do I want to communicate in terms of what feeling I want to instill in the audience? That's the number one thing. The next thing is, what's the level of information that I want to convey? How detailed do I need to be? And it's going to be different for different audiences. For a board presentation, they may or may not know much about how the product works. So I can't get into architecture if they don't know how the product works. So like the speaking to the audience is going to require presenting different kinds of material as opposed to an eng all hands, for example. So, which I consider a high stakes setting. Like, I think presenting to my own team is high stakes. In fact, probably the highest, because I want them to have confidence and energy and feel positive about the company and the organization. And then I'll put together my deck and I'll put a lot of time into presenting it in a way that teaches people. Like, I think education is an important part of our role. So if I'm going to do something technical, I'll actually pull back and pull up in the presentation and explain the ideas I'm trying to explain. Like last year, we were in the midst of a Kubernetes migration, basically containerizing all of our services. So my presentation to the board included a picture of shipping containers and talked about how standardizing shipping containers allowed infrastructure to be standardized, which is why we can get anything to anywhere in the world easily. Magic of shipping containers and how important that is for software. And then I talked about Docker containers, and then I talked about Kubernetes. So doing that education is an important part of it. And then finally, I practice. It's really, really important for me to practice. It might be writing out a script, might be writing down simple notes, or it might not be writing anything down at all, but I will absolutely run through it as if I'm talking to that board, and I will do it multiple times before I meet with them.
Yeah, this is amazing actually, in terms of with any update or any kind of, I would say, stage presence that you get, actually the important part is adapting to your audience in terms of the content and the context that you said, which is can be, it should not sound as a status update. There should be context in terms of well, this is cause of a concern, but how are we addressing it, or why is it cause of a concern, or what led to this actually. So putting more context around that to the teams itself, so they probably have the most clarity, and you need the teams to have most clarity. And then in terms of board meetings, where they probably don't need to know every single working detail or the intricacies, how do you present that in a non-technical fashion, but still something that they can process easily and then act upon actually. So trying to adapt according to your audience is a great call out. And then, as you said at the end, practicing doing a dry run, trying to make sure that it is being delivered in the right manner is key as well actually. Great. Moving on to the next question, we have two more. So if folks need to add, now would be the time. This question from Eden, the first one is, what skills would you recommend for any manager who wants to take a leap to senior management? So even within the whole executive management or leadership hierarchy, actually, how can you go into senior management from being a frontline manager, or just a manager who is just new to this path?
Great question. Let me think about that for a second. So if you're a first line manager, you should already have experience and be developing skills in strong sense of ownership, drive to take on additional responsibility, consistency of delivery. I would say for moving into senior management, what do I look for? I'm looking for actually organizational skills and communication skills. So a lot of what we talked about with executive presence, the things I've talked about it, owning your emotions and being able to educate people at the right level, and clarity in how you express yourself and how you use body language. Those are really, I would say, important pieces for moving into senior management. Probably, so those are the soft skills that I look for. In terms of the actual, has this person demonstrated the abilities the skills for delivery that I look for? Then it really gets down to, have they managed managers? What's their experience managing managers? How successful are they at handling large scope? Can they delegate effectively? Things like that. But probably, I mean, those are really important. I would say the hardest thing to develop, that's the least common, is facility with executive presence and the soft skills that I've been describing.
Got it. Yeah, that makes sense to me, actually. Nothing to add there. All in agreement there. So the last question that we have for the open Q&A is, and I think this is a great way to kind of just wrap things up in terms of, what would be your favorite 3 metrics that you status check frequently, in terms of takeaways, that what could people use actually as gut checks, or just kind of strong indicators that you use in your day-to-day role?
Yeah, I love this question because it's kind of at a right angle to a lot of the things we've been talking about, which are not very metrics oriented. But
yeah,
what are we doing in engineering? We're delivering, right? If we're not delivering, and we're not delivering with throughput and quality, then we're not doing our jobs. So everything that I've been describing is really in service to building a strong organization and being able to deliver. Obviously, with the things I've been talking about, there really aren't any metrics to check. There's getting feedback and seeing how people behave and seeing what the effect is on the organization. But I do care about metrics. And actually, when I read this question, what are the 3 metrics I status check frequently? Hiring, like all the metrics around hiring, the whole funnel, like how many people are we sourcing, how many people are coming on site, I expect my managers to source. And so how many are we on track with sourcing? Is each manager basically being an effective partner to the recruiter that's supporting them by doing sourcing themselves? Attrition. Now, luckily, I should say, thankfully, at Iterable, attrition is incredibly low in engineering and actually in the company in general. So there's very little to keep track of in terms of metrics there. And reliability. And there's a number of metrics around reliability. There's high-level metrics around, mean time to failure and mean time to recover. We're really building out some of these metrics now. Some of them we've had for a while, like mean time to failure is a very common metric of counting the number of incidents between quarters. That basically will give you the inverse of mean time to failure. But mean time to recover is something we're developing now. And obviously SLOs for different services and SLAs, and if we're meeting contractual SLAs. So those are the things that I look at the most. I don't look at personally how much are people checking in. Yeah. How many bugs are getting closed. I do look at find fix rates for bugs for the organization for different bug severities. That tells me general health and fit for service. So yeah, those are the main things. Oh, and I left out security. So vulnerabilities, how many are out of SLA, approaching SLA, things like that.
Yeah, and I think something great about these metrics are that you mentioned is it also ties into Balki's question earlier. When you need to present in high stakes settings, these are the things that matter. How are we doing as an engineering organization in terms of throughput and quality, and also in terms of culture with hiring and attrition actually. So these are great metrics that really give strong indicators of the overall kind of health check of an organization from an engineering perspective, and can be used at times actually in some of these high stake meetings or settings when you need to present higher up actually. So that definitely, yeah, is great. I would love to end this by telling you, Bill, if there's anything else that you need to share that was not covered in this conversation, or questions that you feel is something to keep in mind, or just kind of a key takeaway for all of us. Would definitely love to hear from you on that.
Yeah, thanks, Anand. There's nothing that I want to share that we haven't already talked about, to be honest. I feel like this has been a really great conversation. I've loved your questions, and I've loved the questions from the audience. I feel like we've covered a lot of ground. The one thing I'll leave us with, I'd say, is, from my perspective, the most important part of executive presence is emotional intelligence. And that's something that we develop by understanding ourselves and owning our emotions and our reactions completely. This is really hard to do. It's not something, unfortunately, that every executive does. And I think it's really central. Interesting. Sorry, I just saw one of the questions that came up. I'll get to that. I think it's really central to what we do as executives. I think it's really hard to be effective as an executive if you don't have that emotional intelligence. It's really hard to grow your career if you don't have that. And I've seen it actually in managers who are aspiring to grow their careers. Had a conversation recently with somebody who applied for a management position but wasn't a fit. And the conversation was very bristly. And I think it's so, even when we're managers, and, certainly in my own life and career, I know it's an area for constant improvement. So I would say that for me is the heart of how to maintain executive presence. There are ways you can craft it, I suppose, and try to learn skills and practice them. And you will be doing that. And that is important. And I talked about some of those skills. Impro, by Keith Johnstone, which is Impro in Theater, is the book that I was referring to answer that question. There are things that you can do. Also, I'm noticing I'm saying a lot. So just controlling those kinds of things too. So there are outward skills that you can strengthen and you'll always be developing. But the heart of it is really that emotional intelligence and introspection.
Great. And I think this also relates to the practice that you were saying. Like if you're trying to be too raw without practicing what you will be saying, that is such natural with the pauses and then letting the emotions get the better of you, like what you're thinking in that moment actually. But if you have kind of gathered at least a basic thought process in advance, that really helps actually in terms of how you communicate and collaborate with other peers around you. So thank you so much, Bill, for sharing such wonderful thoughts and takeaways related to executive presence. And that is all.